Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We're finally starting our first book of Season 2. That is Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The first book, The Lightning Thief. So, what hasn't changed from Season 1 is the basic formula of the video. I will give you a brief summary of what happened in these sections we've just read, this video being chapters 1 and 2 of The Lightning Thief, and then we'll talk about things in a little more depth. You ready? Let's go. So chapter 1 starts out with a warning from Percy. You see, he is narrating this entire book, and he wants to let you know right now that being a half-blood is not a good thing. If this book sounds at all familiar or seems to stir something up inside of you, stop reading now. It could get you killed. Warnings are always the best way to start a book. And then we jump into Percy's life. Now, we're starting in media res, understandably. We're starting when he's 12. But we get a lot of information about his life before this point as well. For example, he does have ADHD and dyslexia. He also seems to have some discipline issues. He has been to 6 schools in 6 years. Field trips really don't seem to work out with him, but he has some high hopes for the one he's currently on. You see, his school, a school for problematic students, are on their way to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to look at some Roman and Greek artifacts. Along on this trip with Percy, we actually have his best friend Grover, who's a little nervous boy who tends to cry when upset, and has some disease in his legs that makes walking difficult. Though Percy does note that he seems to run without a problem, especially if there's food nearby. There is also 2 teachers on our trip. We have Mr. Brunner, the Latin teacher, who is supervising the trip because obviously he knows about Greek and Latin stuff, and the one teacher that Percy kind of likes listening to. The other teacher, though, Percy can't stand, and that is Mrs. Dodds, who doesn't seem to like Percy in return. Now, on the trip, they're off viewing the artifacts when Mr. Brunner asks Percy to speak up and tell him about a particular image. Percy can accurately tell him that the image shows Kronos eating his children, and can even tell the vague outline of the entire tale, aka Kronos was a titan who didn't want his children to take over, so ended up eating all of them, but the mother of the children hid Zeus and allowed him to grow up, so Zeus came back, poisoned Kronos, and Kronos threw up all the other gods who have been growing up safe and fine in his belly. The problem is, though, that Percy can't tell Mr. Brunner how this would affect his everyday life. Most of the other students agree with this, so Mr. Brunner does tell Percy off for not trying his hardest. He says these stories are important and he expects the best from Percy. This is where Percy feels really pushed. Nobody else expects anything from him, and Mr. Brunner somehow expects him to be better than he is. This disagreement in what adults are telling him, very difficult for Percy to deal with. But it's fine, he is going to head off and have lunch with his friend Grover. I wish it was that easy. It never is. The weather has been weird in the past couple of days since Christmas. It seems to be a little longer than that, but we're never given a firm time when this trip is happening. Just that it's after Christmas and there's been snowstorms and fires and tornadoes, and it's been weird. Percy doesn't have a lot of time to dwell on this, though, because Nancy Bobafett is here. She is another student at the school who loves tormenting Grover, to the point where Percy's temper gets the best of him, and Nancy somehow ends up in a fountain. Mrs. Dodds takes this opportunity to pull Percy aside and turns into a monster. What? Don't worry, though, Mr. Brunner is here to pass Percy a pen, which is somehow a sword, and Percy uses this sword to kill Mrs. Dodds. But then it's not a sword, and no one seems to recognize that Mrs. Dodds ever existed. Not even Mr. Brunner, who just takes his pen back and tells Percy to remember one next time. Chapter 2 continues on with this storyline, telling us that for the rest of the semester, Percy seems to be the only one who can remember Mrs. Dodds, except for the fact that Grover is a bad liar. You see, every time Percy mentions Mrs. Dodds to Grover, he hesitates before telling him he doesn't exist, a hesitation that he isn't finding with anybody else. Unfortunately, though, due to this insistence that Mrs. Dodds doesn't exist happening from everybody and the continued bad weather, Percy's grades start failing, he becomes moodier and moodier, and starts lashing out more. Ultimately, the school decides not to invite him back next year, which is the polite way of saying he can finish this year, but he is effectively expelled from the school. Percy doesn't really care. He misses home. He wants to go see his mom. He'll deal with his obnoxious stepfather. But he does recognize that he'll miss Mr. Brunner's class and Miss Grover, who he's very concerned is going to get beat up very badly once Percy is gone. He is kind of interested in maybe doing well on the Latin exam because he wants Mr. Brunner to know he's at least trying. Concerned enough about it that he's even willing to go and ask Mr. Brunner for help. When he does, though, he actually overhears Mr. Brunner and Grover talking, and they seem to be talking about some really strange things. Things called friendly ones, Mrs. Dodds is mentioned, kindly ones, sorry. Mrs. Dodds is mentioned, summer solstice. Ultimately, what Percy understands from it is he is in danger, and both of these people think he might be. However, when he almost gets caught overhearing them, it isn't Mr. Brunner that comes out, but something much taller than the man he knows in the wheelchair. And he thinks he might have even seen a bow? Grover continues to ignore this, though, and Mr. Brunner tells Percy that he's not normal, which Percy understandably doesn't appreciate, and they ultimately end their school relationship on a bad note. Grover, though, is still friends with Percy, and they actually catch the same bus back to New York, where Percy finally confronts Grover about the kindly ones, only to have the bus break down. When they're unloaded from the bus, Percy sees 3 old women knitting some gigantic socks across the road, and when Grover spots them, he continues to freak out, but won't tell Percy what's going on. Grover gets back on the bus, while Percy watches these old folks pull out a pair of scissors, and the middle one cuts the thread. Percy gets back onto the bus and explains this to Grover, who ultimately doesn't tell Percy this, but his face is enough to let Percy know that Grover at least thinks this is a death omen. Fun times! Yes, that is a massive amount to already have happened within the first couple of chapters. But from what I've read of Rick Riordan's books, he just tends to keep the action going. And every little bit, from even the small moments with Nancy Dobbs, that would be a real interesting dynamic. No, Nancy Boba Fett and Mrs. Dobbs really gives you a sense that every little thing counts, not just Mrs. Dodds turning into a monster. So there is a lot of things we can talk about in these chapters, a lot of which are questions of the Greek mythology. For example, who are we seeing with the kindly ones and the old ladies knitting? Well, the 3 old ladies are the Fates, and they are knitting the life threads of everybody. When a life thread is cut, that person's life is cut at that point, whether it's long or short. So, Percy seeing these women knitting, yeah, a little uncomfortable. The kindly ones often turn out to be things like harpies or other monsters who are sent after people who have displeased the gods. And Mrs. Dodds seems to insist that Percy knows more of what's going on, that he is hiding things, and that she is here to figure out the truth. Yeah, this is sort of interesting, because we start out this story with just a little bit, and we are supposed to be somewhat lost. If you know the Greek mythology behind some of these things, you can start figuring them out. But Percy actually does know a little bit of this. He admits that the Latin class Mrs. Mr. Brunner teaches is about the one of the only ones he pays attention to. So right from the beginning, we know he knows a little bit about this. He tells us the story of Kronos and his children pretty succinctly at the museum, even if Mr. Brunner says half marks only. But overall, it's not just about the Greek things. And that's the thing you have to be careful about with Rick Riordan's stories. Don't get caught up in the mythology alone, because you'll miss the other hints we're actually getting at throughout the story. For example, one of my first notes on this entire thing is that introduction. Percy basically saying, if this sounds familiar, stop. Like, don't read this, believe whatever lie your mother or father told you, try and have a normal life. It's Percy recognizing that he himself is in a very dangerous position due to his bloodline, and that maybe ignorance is bliss on this one. But the problem is that Percy seems to have this idea that as long as you're not aware, nobody else will be aware as well. Well, obviously that's not how it works. For example, he himself is not directly aware of his half-blood status, but other beings have become aware of him. How did we get Mr. Brunner and Grover knowing all of these things conveniently at the same school as Percy? Obviously, Percy has already been recognized for what he is. So the warning, well, how does that warning work? Isn't it better for somebody to be warned in advance what is coming for them and how to be prepared for that? It depends on the person. If somebody is legitimately overwhelmed by something like this and frightened by it, then they might make worse decisions having been warned in advance. And some people might not be the major focus of things. We're going to find out Percy is due to the entire incident occurring within this novel. Well, some other half-blood could go unnoticed, maybe, because of their godly parent or the lack of anything exciting happening. So maybe the warning works, but it could be perceived as Percy simply stating something he wishes could have happened. It's not actually going to work, just like he can't go back and change the past, but he feels better for having given that warning. Basically, stop now, or treat this all like fiction. But he's then very forward about everything else. He doesn't try and clean up his story. Even if the warning at the start is a bit of a white lie that you can ignore this all from happening, he doesn't try and sugarcoat how disastrous his previous life has been. Like, he admits to accidents that occurred on previous field trips. It sets up a pattern for us readers, but again, Percy is narrating. He could try and make himself sound better here, but he doesn't. He might be offering a warning for half-bloods to stop reading now to avoid any problems, but he also recognizes how just utterly alone he's felt for most of his life. So admitting to the fact that these odd things continued to occur around him, and that he kept getting in trouble, and that he wasn't doing well in school, isn't that for the benefit of all the other half-bloods reading? If we're taking the framing device of this story seriously, if we are assuming that this is happening in the world today, then yes. Any other half-bloods that might pick up this book suddenly understand they're not alone in the world. But even if we're not taking the framing device seriously, even if we accept, oh yeah, no, full fiction, the Greek gods don't exist, this is just happening out of Rick Riordan's imagination, that honesty is still really important to us. It connects us to Percy and what's happening in the world. We're more likely to believe him about all these strange events purely because he's being honest about his own part in them. It's not his fault he hit the wrong lever, but he admits he hit a lever that dropped his school into a shark tank. It's moments like this that are very small, but they let us know that we can understand Percy as a flawed person, just as we can understand ourselves as a flawed person. But we can also trust Percy to admit to those flaws and to the mistakes he's made in the past. It means we're going to trust him when things get really weird. It's also why we tend to take his side when we get upset at people like Mr. Brunner and Grover for not being honest. I think a lot of us, especially for younger generations reading this, often feel brushed off by people older than us. Even when we're feeling something really intensely and we just want someone to be like, that feeling is legitimate, it's a lot of frustration. And having things out of control and not having adults back us, that is amazingly relevant for children of all ages, but especially relevant for young children dealing with things like dyslexia. Dealing with the world treating you like you should be able to do something that you just can't. Like, most people expect you to be able to sit here and read. Well, if the words are moving on the page, if they're out of order, if the letters are out of order, then no, this is not simple. And being told this is simple and you should be able to do it, that's not how it works. But that's why we get this highlight between Mrs. Dodds and Mr. Brunner and Percy's difficulty understanding it. What happens when part of the world tells you that you are constantly worthless because you can't do something this simple, or you're constantly getting in fights, or accidents happen around you and you're constantly getting blamed? If you are constantly being told you're worthless, how do you deal with that? And then how do you balance out somebody like Mr. Brunner, who as a teacher can see the potential in Percy, but isn't necessarily addressing the issue of everybody else telling Percy he's worthless? See, if most people are telling you on one hand you're worthless, and one person is telling you you can do great things, suddenly this person seems like they're just aggressively pushing you. Because everybody else is down here. Half the time you feel down here. This person doesn't feel like they're trying to balance you out. They feel like you could do so much more and you're just not trying. There isn't this middle point of feeling. There isn't somebody saying you can do the normal things. It's either you can't do anything or you can do great things. Well, probably because a lot of us have somebody who says you can do great things. But if you're not down here, if you're up here, this balance feels normal. But Percy's looking at something like this. And yeah, he feels no one's really looking at him. Everybody's looking at the wasted potential or the wasted potential. They're not looking at him. Which is just sort of heartbreaking when you recognize, again, he does know things. His reciting of the Kronos legend at 12 is impressive. Sure, he gets in fights a lot, but right from the beginning, it's because these other people are bullies. He doesn't go after Nancy because she's the weakling and he wants to feel powerful. He goes after Nancy because Nancy is actively bullying Grover. Sure, in chapter 2 we get his sort of outburst when it comes to the teachers, but that's still a power imbalance he's seeing. He's still seeing somebody bigger and more powerful hitting down. So of course he lashes out when he feels just everybody trying to stomp on him. we can understand that. Percy, right from the beginning, is a hero to us in the small things. And then we can see how his life is affected even more once we start getting the big things. Once we get this attack by Mrs. Dobbs, and then everybody acting like it never existed. But it's actually the little things, the very human things, before we even hit the supernatural point, that we can connect to a lot more. That makes Percy a much more believable narrative and friend to us as we read. Because we're never going to fight a Greek monster, but dealing with bullies is something we're going to have to deal with. Deal with teachers who just trip on their own power. And teachers that think we could do great things if we only tried a little harder. We'll also have to deal with parents being disappointed. That's one of the things that Percy doesn't want to deal with. The look of disappointment on his mother's face. When he's at the Museum of Art and is already feeling down before the attack even happens, he wants to hop in a taxi and go see his mom. But he knows she'll be disappointed. Well, it's because our parents often want us to do well. They want the world to treat us kindly. And the world doesn't always treat us kindly. And it becomes a question of how we deal with the fact that the world can be extremely vicious. Running and hiding is sometimes the answer, but you have to recognize Percy's mother in the position that she's in, knowing who her son's father is, and knowing what her son is going to have to face. She kind of recognizes running and hiding isn't a possibility. One, because you're going to have to face it, but two, she's at that point where everybody else who's in the know seems to think maybe he can hide a little longer. So if he is running and hiding, then he's figured something out, and that itself is not going to work. So overall, just Percy dealing with all these people who won't open up about their emotions and what they know, it's really difficult for him. And that might be another reason he's actually extremely honest here. He recognizes that a lot of people lied to him in the past and aren't always honest with him. So showing honesty first, it's what he needed. So he's got to be the person that he used to need. All of us should be the person that we used to need. That's how we fill up the holes in the world. So Percy's honesty right from the beginning is because a lot of other people tried to protect him. That warning at the start is almost lip service for the recognition that no one is going to stop, especially if they recognize themselves in these moments. Everyone's going to keep reading because they need to know. There is just so much more I could talk about here, such as the bad weather affecting Percy. A lot of us can recognize this is true anyways. There's a reason why there's such thing as seasonal depression when we hit the cold winter months with a lot of snow. But we seem to be having a bigger connection here. Sort of every time the weather is noted as acting up, Percy too is noted for acting up. And we're going to see that connection grow as we get more players involved. Just an absolutely fascinating book right from the beginning, with a character whose small beats ultimately seem to mean more than the big action set pieces. And we're going to see how this goes as Percy learns more, because those are going to start fusing a lot closer as we get closer to solving the mystery of who Percy is, and getting more information about this bigger mystery happening, why the weather's acting up, what the summer solstice has to do with this, and why Grover won't be honest with Percy. But to start, Riordan does an excellent job of giving us the little things to connect with this person before we get into a world that we ourselves can only live through Percy Jackson. We're never going to fight these Greek monsters ourselves, but we can believe it because Percy's enough like us. So, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.